"If you don't like your wife, I can be the second," said the Apache woman, but the cowboy had no wife. The Remington was heavier than I remembered. Not the gun itself. I'd carried that thing so long it ought to feel like part of my hand by now. But that morning, sitting on the edge of the cot in Harlan Prute's back room, turning it over in the lamplight, it felt like something borrowed, like it belonged to a different man and I was just holding it until he came back. I set it on the blanket and looked at my hands instead. 61 years old. The knuckles were swollen in the cold. There was a scar across my right palm I couldn't remember getting any more, too many years back, too much in between. Outside I could hear the town of Decker's Flat starting up its morning. Wagons, a dog. Some woman calling a name I couldn't make out. I'd come to Decker's Flat because Harlan owed me money and I needed a bed more than I needed pride. That was the whole of it. No story there. Old man, old debt, 3 days' ride on a horse that deserved better, and here I was in a room that smelled like tallow and old smoke, listening to a town that didn't know my name and wouldn't have cared if it did. That suited me. I'd spent 30 years being known, knew what that cost. Harlan Prute was a decent man who'd grown a gut and lost most of his nerve somewhere in the years since I'd last seen him. He ran a dry goods and feed operation out of a building that leaned slightly east, as if it had been meaning to fall over for a decade and just kept forgetting. He was glad to see me, or glad enough, shook my hand too hard, talked too fast, kept glancing at the Remington on my hip like he was calculating something. He paid me half what he owed on the first day and said the rest would come when a freighter settled up with him. I told him that was fine. It was. I had enough for meals and I didn't need much else. The town had a main street with a hardware, a livery, a saloon that did double work as a barber, a church that looked newer than everything else, and a trading post on the East End run by a man named Cordell who dealt in blankets, hides, dry goods, and whatever else came through. Cordell was half Tejano, built like a man who'd worked hard his whole life and planned to keep doing it, and he had the kind of face that didn't give much away but didn't lie either. I went in there the second morning for tobacco and lamp oil. That was the first time I saw her. She was at the counter, not buying, talking to Cordell in a low voice about something, and from the set of her shoulders it was either a negotiation or an argument, possibly both. Apache. I could see that straight off. Dark hair loose down her back, a blanket wrap over her shoulders the color of old rust, and she turned when I came in the door not because she was startled but because she was paying attention. That was the difference. Most people who turn when a door opens are reacting. She was just watching. I nodded. She didn't nod back. Just looked at me for a moment the way you'd look at weather coming in off the flats, not afraid of it, just taking note, and went back to her conversation with Cordell. I got my tobacco and oil. Cordell was polite, efficient. The woman didn't look at me again. I went back to Harlan's, and that should have been the end of it. Her name was Saya. I learned that from Cordell a few days later when I came back for coffee beans. She comes in twice a month, sometimes more, he said, wrapping the beans in brown paper. Trades hides and beadwork, good work, I always have buyers for it. He paused. Her man died 2 winters back, fever. She's got a daughter 12 or so. They live maybe 4 miles east, up in the breaks. I don't know why he told me all that. Maybe he was a man who liked to talk. Maybe he'd seen something in how I'd stood there in his store for a half-second too long before heading to the counter. I didn't say anything one way or the other, bought my coffee and left. But I thought about it. That's the honest truth of it. I thought about it more than made sense, considering I'd looked at the woman for all of 40 seconds across a trading post. Something about the way she'd turned at the door, the way she didn't perform anything. No smile, no deference, no edge either. Just a person taking stock of what was in front of her. I hadn't been looked at like that in a long time, straight on, like I was actually there. The next week I was eating at the saloon. They did a noon meal for a nickel, beans and fatback mostly, but it was hot. when three men came in loud and pushed a table together in the middle of the room like they owned the floor. Drifters of some kind, trail-worn, the particular loose manner of men who'd been a while without consequence. I didn't pay them much attention at first. I was most of the way through my plate. Then one of them said something, and the other two laughed, and I caught the word Apache in there and the word squaw and a few other things that don't bear repeating. I looked up. They were talking about nothing specific, just the generalized contempt of bored men with audience. Didn't seem to involve anyone present. I went back to my plate. But I remembered it. Held on to it, the way you hold onto something you don't know, yet what you'll need it for. I saw Sayer again that Friday. I was at the livery doing a second check on my horse's left front shoe. He'd been favoring it slightly, and I didn't trust Harlan's judgment on horseshoes. When she came in with a line of 3 horses she was bringing to sell or trade. Good animals. You could see that. Well kept, calm, which said something about whoever'd been handling them. She was talking to the liveryman, Estes, a thin, quiet man who knew horses and not much else. I stayed with my own animal and kept to myself. But the livery wasn't large, and after a few minutes she was working one of her horses into the stall next to mine, and we were maybe 6 feet apart. She looked over. Then, matter of fact, as if we'd been in the middle of a conversation. "You are the one they call Cord Delahan." It wasn't a question. I looked at her. "Mostly I'm called Cord." "Cordell told me your name." She went back to settling the horse. "He said you used to be a man people were afraid of." "Used to be," I said. She glanced over again briefly. "He said you still are. He just said you don't use it for money anymore." I didn't answer that. I wasn't sure Cordell was wrong. She finished with the horse, ran her hand once down its neck, then straightened and looked at me straight on again. That same unhurried taking stock I'd seen the first morning. "You have been here 2 weeks," she said. "You don't talk much, you don't drink much, you eat alone." A pause. "What are you waiting for?" I said, "I'm not waiting for anything." She considered that, nodded once like she was filing it away, and walked past me toward Estes. I stood there with my hand on my horse's shoulder and the smell of hay and manure around me and something moving in my chest I hadn't felt in a long time. Not love, I want to be precise about that. Not yet. Something earlier. Like a window had been opened in a room that had been shut up for years. The thing about living a long time with a reputation is it shapes you in ways you don't fully see until someone doesn't have it. For 30 years, every room I walked into, every man I spoke to, every transaction I made, it was all conducted in the shadow of what people had heard or thought they'd heard about me. The stories were never quite right. Some were worse than the truth, some better. All of them made me into something I had to either live up to or push against, and after a while I just stopped doing either. Just got quieter, smaller, let the space around me do the work. Saya hadn't heard any of it, or if she had from Cordell or somewhere else, she wasn't conducting herself accordingly. She looked at me the way a person looks at a person. Not a legend, not a threat, not an old relic. Just a man in a livery stable with a lame horse. I can't explain what that was worth. I'm not sure I have the words for it. But I was 61 years old, and I had slept in more than 300 different beds across 5 territories, and I had never once had a woman look at me the way Saya looked at me in that livery. Like I was actually, specifically, only myself. I started going to Cordell's more than I needed to. The tobacco ran out faster. I found reasons to need things: a new knife strop, a particular grade of oil for the Remington, a length of rope. Cordell was not a man who remarked on things, and I was grateful for that. He filled my orders and didn't say much, and sometimes Saya was there and sometimes she wasn't, and the days she wasn't were longer and flatter, and I didn't think too hard about what that meant. When she was there we talked, or she did mostly. I've never been a man of many words, and she seemed to regard that as acceptable. She'd talk about her horses, the work of the hides, what the weather looked like coming off the mountains. Sometimes she'd ask me something direct, what I thought of a horse's gait, whether I'd been through a particular pass, what the settlements were like in the southern territories, and I'd answer, and she'd take the answer in and set it somewhere and move on. Once she asked me about the scar on my palm. I said I didn't remember where it came from. She looked at it for a moment. It healed clean, she said. Someone took care of it. I thought about that for a long time after. I couldn't remember who. I'd been patched up by enough people in enough places that they'd blurred together. But she was right, somebody had. Somebody had cleaned that wound and wrapped it, and it had healed clean. And here I was carrying the evidence of it 30 years later, whoever they were long gone. The trouble with the three drifters came on a Tuesday. I'd heard them around town a few more times in the 10 days since the saloon. They'd made camp somewhere outside of town rather than paying for rooms, which told me they were either low on money or not planning to stay long. Men who camp rather than room are usually moving through or building up to something. One of them, the biggest, had an attitude I recognized from years back. The kind that needs an audience. The kind that's always testing the room. I was at Cordell's that Tuesday morning when Saya came in. She'd brought beadwork this time, a collection of it laid out in a flat wooden box. Good work, intricate, the kind of thing Cordell sold to traders heading east where there was a market for it. She and Cordell were going through the pieces when the three drifters came in. I don't know if they'd followed her or if it was just bad timing, maybe both. The big one, Garrett, I heard the others call him, looked at the beadwork and made a comment about Indian trinkets. Then he looked at Saya and made a comment about her. Low and ugly. The other two thought it was funny. Cordell said, flat and quiet, I'd ask you to keep it civil in my store. Garrett looked at Cordell the way a man looks at something he's decided isn't worth being careful with. I'd been in the back of the store near the oil shelf. I came forward. I didn't say anything right away. I came forward and stood so that I was between Garrett and the counter where Saya was, not touching anyone, not threatening anything with my hands, just there. Garrett looked at me. He was maybe 35, big through the shoulders, 2-day beard, eyes that had the particular dull shine of a man who's used to winning arguments with his size. He looked at me, 61, gray-headed, nothing obviously formidable about me, and I could see the calculation. I said, the woman is doing business here. You're welcome to come back when she's done. Quiet, conversational. Garrett smiled. Old man, I didn't ask your opinion. No, I said, you didn't. There was a long moment. The two behind him were very still. Something in the air had changed. People get a feel for these things even when they can't name it. And I'd watched a lot of men pick up that feeling over the years and decide it was smarter to be somewhere else. Garrett wasn't smart, but he wasn't all fool either. He looked at me for another 3 or 4 seconds, and then he looked at his friends, and then he made a show of the whole thing not being worth his time, turned around and walked out. The other two followed. Cordell said nothing. Saya said nothing. I went back to the oil shelf, got what I'd come for, paid Cordell, walked out into the sun. I hadn't drawn the Remington, hadn't raised my voice. My hands hadn't shaken. I was 100 yards down the street before I heard footsteps behind me, quick and deliberate, and I turned and Saya was there. She stopped a few feet away, looked at me. You did not have to do that, she said. I know. A pause. Something moved in her face, not the calculating look, not the stock-taking. Something else, something quieter. Why did you? I held her eyes for a moment. I didn't have a clean answer. The real one was that I'd been watching her for 3 weeks, and she was the only person in that town who'd looked at me like a man rather than a reputation or a relic. And the thought of something ugly touching her made something old and not quite dead in me come fully awake. I said it needed doing. She held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she said, "Come to my fire on Saturday, I will feed you." I said I would. She walked back toward Cordell's. I watched her go and then stood there in the main street of Decker's flat with the sun coming straight down and felt, for the first time in a long while, like I was where I was supposed to be. The ride out to her camp that Saturday was 4 miles on a good trail through high desert scrub that opened, near the end, into a flat of tall grass with the breaks rising behind it. She had a solid camp, not a temporary thing. A permanent structure, low-walled with a good roof, and beside it a pole corral with 4 horses in it, and a fire ring with the ash of long use. Her daughter, who she'd called Nita, was at the corral when I rode in, watching me with dark, serious eyes and not saying anything. Saya came out of the structure when she heard my horse. She was wearing something different than the trading post clothes, a plain dress the color of the grass, her hair down. She didn't make ceremony of greeting me, just said, "Put your horse in the corral. Nita will see to him." Nita took my horse without being asked, and led him to the corral with the competence of someone who'd been doing it since she could walk. We ate outside, at a flat rock near the fire. Saya had made something slow-cooked, venison and corn, and something bitter I couldn't identify, but that was good. We didn't talk much for the first part of the meal, not uncomfortable quiet, just the kind where 2 people are eating and not performing. After a while Nita disappeared into the structure, and it was just the 2 of us and the fire, and the sound of horses moving in the corral. Saya said, "You are going to leave." It wasn't a question. I thought about how to answer it. "When Harlan settles up," I said, "probably." "And then where?" "South maybe. I've got money owed in 2 other places." She looked at the fire. "You collect old debts," she said. "That is your traveling now." That landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to, and I didn't respond to it right away. "I don't have a better reason to go places," I said finally. "Not anymore." She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and I could see her face in the light, not young, not soft, a face that had known work and loss and cold and kept going. A face I would have trusted without knowing a thing about the person inside it. She said, "My husband was a good man. He worked hard. He was kind to Nita and to me. When he died, the cold came in and it did not leave." She paused. "I thought, I am 40 years old, this is what it is now, just the cold and the work." She looked at me then. "Then you walked into Cordell's store." I held her eyes. "I am an Apache woman," she said, plain as weather. "I say what I mean. I will tell you what I see." She picked up a small stick and turned it in her hands once. "I see a man who is capable and quiet and has not been soft even though he has been alone for a long time. I see a man who stood between me and trouble without being asked and did not make theater of it. I see a man who listens when I talk and does not talk when he has nothing to say." She set the stick down. "I have looked for this man since my husband died. I did not find him in 4 years. Then you came to collect an old debt in a town you had no other reason to visit." I was very still. "I am not a woman who leans on a man," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I carry my own weight. I always have." A pause. "But I am also not a woman who pretends not to see what is in front of her." I said, "Saya." "What?" "I'm 61 years old. I've got a bad knee and a reputation I'd rather be done with, and I haven't stayed in one place longer than a season since before you were born." She looked at me steadily. "I know how old you are," she said. "I know about your knee, and I know about the reputation. Cordell told me more than he probably should have. I am not afraid of any of that." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you telling me these things because you want me to change my mind?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "Good." We sat by that fire for another 2 hours. Nita came back out and listened to the adult conversation from a polite distance, and at some point fell asleep wrapped in a blanket near the structure wall. The horses were settled in the corral. The stars out here were thick and close the way they get when you're away from any town. No haze, nothing between you and all of it. Saya said, At some point in the middle of something, we'd been talking about horses, I think, or water rights. I don't remember how we got there. If you do not like your wife, I can be the second. I looked at her. She was completely serious. Also, and this was what took me a beat to find, slightly amused by something. By me. By whatever expression was on my face. I don't have a wife, I said. I know, she said. I asked Cordell. There was a long silence, and then something moved through me that had been locked up for so long I almost didn't recognize it. Not laughter exactly. I'm not much of a laughing man, but close to it. A loosening. Like a rope that had been pulled taut for 20 years going slack all at once. I said, you asked Cordell if I had a wife. I needed to know. When? 3 weeks ago, she looked into the fire. The second time I saw you in his store. 3 weeks ago. She'd been making sure of things for 3 weeks while I'd been in Harlan's back room wondering if any of this was in my head. I looked at her profile in the firelight, the straightness of it, the calm. I said, I'm not an easy man to be around. I know, she said, I am not an easy woman. I stopped, started again. I haven't had anyone in a long time who wanted me around, not like, I stopped again. I'm not built for speeches. She turned from the fire and looked at me, not the stock-taking look. Not even the quiet, assessing look I'd gotten to know. Something else. Something that looked at me and didn't look away. She reached across the short space between us and put her hand over mine. Just that. Just her hand on mine, both of us sitting there in the firelight with the horses breathing behind us and her daughter asleep against the wall. She said, I am looking for a man who knows how to stay. I turned my hand and held hers. We stayed there by that fire for a long time after. I went back to Harlan's that night and sat on the edge of the cot in the dark and held the Remington again. Turned it over like I'd done that first morning. Something had shifted in it. Not the weight was the same, but the way I was holding it. Like I was deciding about it, rather than just carrying it. I set it down on the blanket. I thought about what Harlan still owed me and what I'd told Saya about going south. Old debts. I'd been collecting old debts for years. Money owed, obligations, reasons to keep moving. I'd been using them like a man uses a trail. Just go to the next marker. Don't have to think about why. I thought about a woman saying, I am looking for a man who knows how to stay, and putting her hand over mine, and meaning every word of it. I thought about being 61 with a bad knee and a name people had heard, and a life that had been spent mostly horizontal, moving across the face of things, never into them. I didn't make any decisions that night. I'm not the kind of man who makes decisions at midnight based on feelings, but I lay down on that cot and looked at the ceiling and the thing that had been pressing on my chest for 30 years, the particular weight of being unknown to anyone, of meaning nothing specific to any one person in any one place. It had lifted some. Just some. But you notice when a thing that heavy moves at all. Harlan paid me the rest of what he owed on Thursday. I went to Cordell's on Friday. Saya was there. We talked for a while about nothing in particular, and then I told Cordell I'd be staying on another few weeks. Did he know of anyone who needed a hand with anything, horses, hauling, whatever there was? Work, not charity. Cordell said there was a rancher north of town who needed winter fence work done, if I didn't mind cold and posts. I said I didn't mind. I looked at Saya. She said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved. The fence work took 12 days. Hard, cold, satisfying the way only purely physical work is satisfying when you've been idle too long. My hands blistered and then hardened. My knee complained but held. The rancher, a man named Webb, was decent and didn't make conversation he didn't need to, which I respected. I went to Saya's camp 3 times during those 12 days, ate at her fire, talked with her and Nita, helped repair a section of the corral that had gone soft in one corner. Nita was 12 and serious and looked at me with her mother's eyes, that same straight-on, nothing-hidden look. And after the third visit she started talking to me directly rather than past me, which I took as a kind of acceptance I hadn't asked for but was glad to have. Saya and I were not rushing anything. We were two careful people who had learned to be careful by being careless once or twice and paying for it. But there was something building between us that had the weight of something real, the kind of weight that isn't romantic, isn't performing anything, is just two people finding that the space between them has gotten smaller without either of them forcing it. One evening near the end of the fence work, I was at her fire and she was working on a piece of beadwork in the lamplight, intricate, slow, the kind of work that takes weeks, and I was doing nothing in particular, just there, watching the fire, and she looked up and said, "You are different when you are not watching yourself." I said, "What do you mean?" "When you came to Cordell's at first, you were watching yourself, making sure you were taking up the right amount of space, saying the right amount of words, like a man who has been told for a long time that he is too much of something." I thought about that. "And now," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Now you are just here," she said, and went back to the beadwork. Just here. I can't explain why that did what it did to me. Maybe you have to be a man who spent 30 years being a thing to other people, a threat, a legend, a cautionary tale, a name passed around in saloons, to understand what it means to be told you are just here. Not a thing. Just yourself in a specific place at a specific fire, and that is enough. More than enough. The three drifters hadn't gone anywhere. I'd seen them around town 3 or 4 times in the week since the store. They'd found odd work somewhere or were waiting on something, and they'd settled into that particular sullen rhythm of men who have a grievance they haven't acted on yet. Garrett watched me whenever he saw me. Not a confrontation, just watching, marking. I told Sayer about it one evening. Not to worry her, just because she was the person I told things to now, and I didn't want her to be caught off guard. She listened, then said, "What will you do?" "If they leave it alone, nothing," I said. "If they don't," I stopped. "I'm not sure yet." "You don't want to use the gun," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, said the way she said most things plainly, like she could see through to the thing and was just noting it. "No," I said, "I've used it enough." She was quiet a moment, then, "But you would. If it came to that." She nodded, "I know." And then, "It will not come to that. Men like that, they test until they find the edge, then they go find someone easier." She was right, as it turned out. Garrett pushed at me one more time, a direct word outside the saloon, louder than necessary with an audience, and I looked at him the way I'd learned to look a long time ago and said, very quietly, "I won't say anything twice." He held it for a moment, and then he didn't, and 3 days later the three of them rode out of Decker's flat and I never saw them again. Saya didn't say anything when I told her. She just made a sound that meant she'd known how it would go. That certainty of hers, not arrogance, just clear-eyed reading of what was actually in front of her, was something I'd started to lean on without noticing when I'd started leaning on it. There was an evening, maybe 6 weeks after I'd first walked into Cordell's store, when I was sitting at Saya's fire and the night had come down full and cold and Nita had gone in to sleep. The horses were restless. There was a smell of weather in the air, distant lightning. I could hear it. Saya was next to me, close the way she sat sometimes now, not touching, just close. She said, "I want to tell you what I told you before, but properly." I looked at her. "I want you to stay," she said. "Not for another few weeks, not to collect another debt. I want you to stay here." She met my eyes. "I know what I am asking. I know you have been moving for 30 years and that staying is harder than going. I know your reputation will follow you here and men will have opinions and it will not be simple." A pause. "I am not asking you because I need someone. I am asking you because I want you. This specific man, not the name, not the reputation. You." She said it plainly, with no dramatics, the way she said everything. but the plainness was what made it go all the way in. I had been asked for a lot of things in my life: money, skills, loyalty, violence, time. I had been needed in the utilitarian sense more times than I could count: my gun, my name, my ability to be in the right place looking like the right thing. I'd been useful. I'd never been wanted. Not like this, not by name, not you specifically. I reached over and I took her hand. She let me. We sat like that while the night came down, and the distant lightning moved, and the horses settled, and the fire burned low. And I thought about how I'd come to this place to collect a $20 debt from a man who'd owed it to me for 15 years, and how that $20 had led me here, to this fire, to this woman who had asked Cordell 3 weeks in whether I had a wife, and who now was telling me she wanted me to stay. There are things that happen in a life that you cannot account for by any logic you had going in. You make plans and then something tips the whole table and the plans go. In 30 years I'd learned that the table tipping usually meant loss. Something taken, something ending, the ground going out from under you. I hadn't understood until that night at that fire that it could tip the other way. That something could be given when you'd stopped expecting anything to be given. I said, "I'll stay." She squeezed my hand. That was all. No big moment, no dramatizing it. 2 people sitting in the dark, and one of them saying what needed saying and the other holding on. That was almost 2 years ago now. The fence work led to other work, regular work, for Webb and for 2 other ranchers who needed a steady man who knew horses and wouldn't steal from them. The Remington is still in my kit. I still clean it on Sunday mornings and the weight of it is familiar, but it hasn't come out of the kit in a long time, and I'd be glad if it stayed there. Nita is 14 now, and she talks to me like I've always been here, which I suppose is the highest thing a girl that age can give a man who came in from outside. She argues with me about horses. She thinks she knows more than me, and she may be right, and she has her mother's way of looking at a problem until it gives up its answer. Saya and I, we have built something. Not fast, not smooth. There have been hard patches. Her independence and my silence can work against each other when one of us is carrying something the other one can't see, but we know how to come back to the fire and sit down and sort through what there is to sort. She has not become less herself since I came. She is still the woman who says exactly what she means, who handles her own business, who does not lean except when she chooses to. Her choosing is what makes it matter. I am not a different man than the one I was, but I am less alone in being this man, and that is everything. Some mornings I stand out in the yard before the sun is fully up, cold air, the horses waking up in the corral, the mountains gray in the east, and I think about the 30 years of moving. All the towns and beds and roads and debts and reputations. All the space I covered and how little of it stuck to me. How I had been moving so long I'd started to think motion was the point. On one of those mornings not long ago, Saya came out and stood beside me. Didn't say anything. Just stood there with her blanket around her shoulders and looked at the mountains the same direction I was looking. After a while she said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "Nothing much." She looked at me sideways, that corner of her mouth that I know now. That means she sees through what I just said, and then she looked back at the mountains. We stood there while the sun came up. That was enough. That was more than enough. The whole of my life, I'd been moving toward this and hadn't known the direction. Now I do.